Controversial facts about IQ by Jordan Peterson. IQ is a measurement of intelligence in the brain, which means that it's something that you're born with, just the same as you're born with 2 arms or 2 ears or 2 eyes, or the same as you're born, I don't know, with a music talent, or the same as you're born with a sports talent or whatever. So the idea is that, of course, people are gonna see this as controversial because another person's higher IQ means that it's less difficult for them to achieve success. However, in my opinion, IQ is not the dominant factor to achieve success. In my experience, at least, it's it's negative emotion which really does most of the job. Like if you are depressed, if you are sad, if you are overhyped, so like very very happy, if you can't control your emotions, that to me is like, I don't know. I've just seen a lot of people fail because of it. Negative emotion to me, management I should say of negative emotion is like number one. Because the way why I say this is not just because of observation, but also because, people generally speaking have difficult lives. So they don't have easy lives. They weren't born in like midst of fucking Hollywood or something like that. So they're born in poor places. They're born in, I don't know, in very, very weak upbringings, I should say. So without any political power, without any business, with nothing. Basically saying they start from zero. They start from scratch. So for a lot of people, it's very, very difficult to manage that. Very, very difficult. And I don't mean this in an exaggerated way. I mean exactly what I'm saying. So I do see IQ playing a crucial factor. Though I'm not going to say that intelligence doesn't help. But to me, I don't know if at least in my perspective, it doesn't stay as the number one factor to achieve success. But that some people are smarter than others, man, you're gonna have to be blind to deny that. It's like willingly delusional. Is that there's no other way. There's really no other way. I mean, you know that IQ is born. It's born in a person. Why would you I don't know. Why don't you go to Michael Jordan and say we will extract your basketball talent? Because it's unfair for the rest of us. Like, it doesn't work that way. It really doesn't. But let's see what he has to say. I think I've seen the full lecture a week ago. But still, this is very entertaining. Look how he stands, pointing with this, I don't know, laser tag. What is this?
Okay, now down to cognitive ability.
Oh yeah, this is very funny. This is where he goes into debunking the myths of emotional intelligence or practical intelligence or whatever the hell. This is very funny.
Well,
listen to this, it's very funny.
How can you conceptualize intelligence? Well, this is a major problem because your initial conceptualization determines in part the strategies that you're going to use to investigate intelligence. And
what that means is as smarter you are, the better you're going to be able to grasp what intelligence is. Meaning the lower your IQ, the more difficult it's going to be for you to actually understand what IQ is, which is very funny.
Say when you pare a sentence down to what is intelligence, the sentence is problematic because part of it is a question about if and how such a thing might manifest itself in the world. So there's a fact out there or a set of facts that correspond to intelligence, but the other problem is, well, what do you mean when you say intelligence? And you kind of have to nail that down if you're going to have a conversation about intelligence that doesn't go entirely astray. And so you've got a definitional problem as well as an empirical problem. And so there have been, and this was especially true in the 1990s, people have been studying intelligence, IQ intelligence, since the 1920s, and it is a very well-established branch of psychology. One of the things I have to tell you about IQ research is that if you don't buy IQ research, you might as well throw away all the rest of psychology.
The way how I understand is that the whole of psychology is based on IQ, meaning not every. The way how I see it is that the most of the studies that have been made on the psychological field of science, I should say, they are based on IQ, meaning that IQ is the cause that predicts the other effects, be they disorder or be they proper function or whatever it is. They're all based on IQ. So if you throw away IQ, you also throw away everything else. It's like underlying fact, which builds up all the others.
And the reason for that is that the psychologists, first of all, who developed intelligence testing were among the early psychologists who instantiated the statistical techniques that all psychologists use to verify and test all of their hypotheses. So you end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And the IQ people have defined intelligence in a more stringent and accurate way than we've been able to define almost any other psychological construct. And so if you toss out the one that's most well defined, then you're kind of stuck with the problem of what are you going to do with all the ones that you have left over that are nowhere near as well defined or as well measured or whose predictive validity is much less and has been demonstrated with much less vigor and clarity. Anyways, despite all that, people have posited a number of different intelligences, and reasonably so, because if you think of intelligence as that which might move you forward successfully in the world, obviously there's a fair number of phenomena that are associated with individuals that might fit into that category. So we have people have made these distinctions. Bob Sternberg, for example, has distinguished between practical versus analytical intelligence, and he kind of thinks of practical as like street smarts, and has attempted to dissociate that from the kind of analytical intelligence that that characterizes more straight IQ research. I don't think he's done it successfully as well at all, and
I don't think he's done it successfully at all. I think he sucks donkey dick.
Since the 1990s, interest in his practical intelligence has declined precipitously, because when it is matched head-to-head with standard IQ intelligence, the IQ intelligence eats up all the variability. What's really happened, as far as I can tell so far, is that when we're trying to predict people's course through life, IQ does a very good job, and then one of the traits does a very good job as well, which is conscientiousness. But it doesn't do as good a job as IQ. Now that partly might be because we can't measure conscientiousness very well. We're stuck with self-reports, or maybe I could gather peer reports about you, or I could gather your parents' reports about you, or teachers' reports, and each of those seems to pick up a little bit more of the pattern, because you know yourself, but other people know you differently than you know yourself, and there's still some accuracy in that. You can get multiple rater reports of something like conscientiousness, and that'll up its predictive validity. But in the final analysis, the best you seem to be able to do with conscientiousness is about a 0.4 correlation with long-term performance, whereas with IQ, in complex jobs, you can probably get 0.5 and maybe 0.6. And so 0.5 is 25% of the variance. You got to square it. 0.6 is 36% of the variance, and 0.4 is 16% of the variance. So even at the low end, let's say high end for conscientiousness is 0.4 or 16%. Low end for IQ is 0.5 or 25%. Low end estimates of IQ make it 1.5 times more powerful than the high end estimates of conscientiousness. And I think that's about right. You'd think, why do we even have to debate this? And because it's so bloody obvious to me that intelligence is a major predictor of life success. I mean, people, I've measured the IQ of University of Toronto people, you know, people in this room who have an IQ of less than 120 are rare. Well, why? Well, smart people go to university. Now, is that actually a contentious statement? Well, it shouldn't be a contentious statement.
I'm reading some undertone in which he goes against the postmodernists here, because who else would say that that is a contentious statement or a controversial fact? Controversial as opposed to what? What is the versial? What is the right way how to think it? Why would this be controversial? See, going against this would be controversial, not that this being said is itself controversial. Some people are born different, man. Very small number of people, but they're born different. I really don't see this as a factor of complaint, though. Let the smart people be smart. Look, with a lot of intelligence also comes a lot of management. So if you are Ted Kaczynski and you have an IQ of 165 and you basically, I don't know, you study mathematics for entertainment, algebra, complex algebra for entertainment, you understand that it's also going to be very, very difficult to keep you in line. So like, are you sure you want that? It's a real question, because in order to be like that successful, I don't know, we can also take Michael Jordan as an example here. In order to be that successful, you're gonna have to be obsessed with the thing that you're doing. You're gonna have to do it 24/7, like no off time. Elon Musk says he works like 16 hours per day, every day, no Saturday or Sundays off, every fucking day. It's like, you're gonna get a lot of IQ, but you're also gonna get a hell of a lot of responsibility. Are you the guy to really want that? It's you could achieve more success. This is true. It's way easier if you have a higher IQ. But the point is that with a higher IQ comes a shit ton of other things that you have to worry about. I don't know. I actually don't know. I don't think it's the main, as I said before, I don't think IQ is the main issue in which you can regard success as a relative to. So IQ is not the dominant factor to predict success, not in my opinion at least. There are so many variables in life. It's like IQ is just, it's a very powerful one, but it's one. It's not many. It's not 150,000. What if a tragedy strikes? Like, how are you going to predict your destiny? How are you going to say that because you have a higher IQ, you're going to go on YouTube, or you're going to start a business, or you're going to, I don't know, what are you going to do with an IQ? It's like, it's unpredictable. Life doesn't go to serve anyone. That's just incorrect. You have to do it yourself, and you have to find a way to do it yourself. It's not going to work because of IQ, like just because of IQ.
Statement, it's self-evident. Universities were actually set up so that smart people could expand their abilities. That's why they were there, and you're selected on the basis of assessments that are essentially there to assess something like intelligence.
So being able to perform those puzzles.
Yes, but that is part of the controversy. Is it reasonable? And this is a measurement issue. And that's why I've been instructing you to some degree in psychometrics, because we actually know how to do this. We know how to answer that question. So let's take a look at how intelligence has been assessed.
I couldn't really hear what she said, but I think she meant to say that, can you actually measure this? Like, can you quantify it? Can you actually say that people with a higher IQ are better than those with a lower IQ? Like, how are you determining high and low? And he answered that we can actually measure it. I think that's what she meant, but she has no microphone, so I can't actually hear.
Assessed and why, and then you can make up your own mind. Anyways, here's some of the examples of other forms of intelligence.
Look at the quotation marks.
And so then the question is, well, what does it mean to have a different form of intelligence? Would form A and form B be completely uncorrelated, like extroversion, say, and neuroticism, or would they be slightly correlated, or would they be highly correlated? And then you might ask, well, how highly correlated do they have to be before they're the same thing? Or how uncorrelated do they have to be before they're different things? And actually the answer to that comes down to something like practical utility. It's like, imagine I'm trying to figure out how well you'll do in university. And I measure one thing, and it's correlated at 0.7 with another thing I measure about you. Then I might say, well, are those two things the same or different? They're pretty highly correlated. You're high in one, it means you're going to be high in the other. Well, so is there any utility in measuring both things? And the way you figure that out, actually, is you do it statistically. So we take the target, which might be your performance across university. And then we say, well, can we predict your performance across university better by using one variable or two variables? So we would enter them both into a regression equation. All a regression equation does, it's quite simple. So you're trying to predict the target, and the regression equation tells you how well you can predict that target if you know another fact. Now then it gets a little complicated, because that's a correlation. How well you can predict B with A. Well, a regression will say how much you can predict C if you know A and B, or A and B and C and D and E, because you can use multiple predictors, and you can weight them. So it might be 2 times A plus 1 times B equals C. And that's all a regression equation does. It's just multiplication and addition. Very, very straightforward. And so two variables are sufficiently different functionally if you can use both of them simultaneously to predict something of interest. So again, it's a tool-like approach. This is how the psychometricians do it. Is something real? Well, it's real if you can measure it, and it helps you predict. That's how it's defined. So then you might say, well, are there these multiple intelligences? Well, the first question would be, well, what do you mean by are there? And the answer to that would be, well, let's specify the question. Since we're going to be scientific about it, let's predict how well people do in university. We'll start with the assumption that intelligence, if intelligence isn't associated with university success, then you're probably not talking about intelligence. Now you could argue that, right? Because you could say, well, intelligence has nothing to do with university success. But that's a definitional matter. We'd have to agree to begin with. Is it reasonable to start with the presupposition that intelligence and university success share something in common? Well, I think you have to be daft to deny that initial proposition, although you could.
Daft.
Because you could say it was privilege or socioeconomic status or any number of sociological phenomena, and some of those are obviously relevant. Social class, for example. Because, you know, if you're in a higher social class, and all things being equal, intelligence included, if you're in a higher social class, you're more likely to go to university than you are if you're in a lower social class. So there's other factors that are going to influence whether or not you do well in university, but we're going to assume that one of them might be intelligence. Well, then you would ask, well, if you measured social intelligence, so that's, what do they call that? Social intelligence? No, emotional intelligence, which does not exist, by the way. Emotional intelligence.
I've heard so many people talk about emotional intelligence. I'm emotionally intelligent. Ooh. There are books written about this. Emotional intelligence. This is like, I don't know, this is like non-intelligent people patting themselves on the back. You can do this, go ahead. You don't have analytical intelligence, but you have emotional intelligence. I don't know, man. It's you can do math, but you really like a drama movie. I don't know, man.
Moral intelligence, linguistic, musical, logical, mathematical, spatial, body kinesthetic, interpersonal, and interpersonal. All different forms of intelligence. Okay, so to answer the question of whether they exist, what you do first is pick a target, prediction of university performance. Then you make a measure for each of them. Then you test to see if the measure measured the same thing across multiple instances within the same person. That's a reliability test, because what the hell good is your ruler if it stretches when you use it? It has to measure the same thing multiple times. And then you would say, okay, we'll take all these different intelligences measured the way we've decided to measure them. The first thing we'll do is see how highly correlated they are, because if they're two of them are completely correlated, then you have one, you don't have two, because that's virtually the definition of one instead of two. You can factor analyze them and see if you can pull out what's common across all of them. That's another thing, because then you might say, well, intelligence is what's common across all the measures of these intelligences. It's a proposition, it's not a fact. You have to decide if you're going to agree with it. But that, if you were going to do that, you'd use a factor analysis. You'd say, well, if someone was more likely to be musical, if they were also high in linguistic ability, and more likely to be logical and mathematically inclined if they had high spatial ability, etc., then you'd be hypothesizing that there was one factor behind all of those manifestations that's somehow similar. And maybe there wouldn't be. And then you'd take all your measures and you'd put them in something like a multiple regression analysis, and you'd predict your target, university performance. And then maybe you'd say, well, wait a minute, let's not just use university performance. Let's use junior high performance, high school performance, university performance, and job success. And then let's say that the only things that predict success across all of those categories and that are the same we're going to define as intelligence. Well, that's basically how you end up with IQ. You could say that IQ is what's common across all possible sets of intelligence tests. Now, people are going to debate that because you still have to define what constitutes a test. But the way the psychometricians have managed it and have taken care of this, at least to some degree, is to say, well, we're not going to define everything that we measure as intelligence. So extroverted people are more socially fluent. Are we going to call that intelligence? No. We're going to call that personality. We're going to call that extroversion. And we're going to call stress tolerance. You could say, well, if you can tolerate more stress, you're more intelligent. It's like, well, no, that isn't how we've defined it. We're going to define that as being lower in neuroticism. If you're cooperative, you're more intelligent. That's emotional intelligence. Well, what? You're less intelligent if you're competitive? Well, no. So we've parsed that off to agreeableness. So then the question might be, is there anything left of these so-called intelligences once you control for personality and IQ? And the answer is no. Nothing. Nothing left of them. And the people who keep pushing these ideas keep trying to push them because they don't like the idea of real individual differences. And to me, that's just a matter of sticking your damn head in the sand, because it's obvious. Here, you're going to have a child. You want the child to have an IQ of 65 or 145. Decide. Okay, so you're all going to vote. Okay, you think any one of you is going to vote to have a child with an IQ of 65. That child's going to have a hard time developing even linguistic ability. They're never going to learn to read, right? They're never going to leave home, in all likelihood. So which child are you going to pick? Well, so do you believe in intelligence or not? Well, obviously, if you have any sense.
Yeah, he's mad with the postmodernist. They don't believe in individual differences. Well, I think what they mean is that they don't believe in individual to begin with. All people are the same if all people were the same. It's like, how can you say anyone could be different if, how can you say everyone is the same if no one was different? So it's, where does the comparison come from? So for example, if you have two pens and pens like pencils, like stuff you write with, and you say that they are the same, but where does the concept of the same start with? Because for something to be the same or different from one another, you need to compare them. Difference exists. Difference really exists. Exists. Alright, Jordan Peterson, as always, very entertaining. I like his bashing of the postmodernist, communist, whatever the fuck they are. This was controversial facts about IQ. I just keep watching these videos because I actually don't know what else to watch in YouTube. Subscribe to this channel, Bite-Sized Philosophy. I haven't, because I'm pretty sure I'm gonna get upset with it. Like bored, not upset. And yeah, that's it. If you watch this video, put a like, a subscribe, a comment, join me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, where else am I? Reddit, Discord. I have a Discord channel. I have Patreon if you want to help me out. If you would. I don't know if you will. I don't think you will. 20 people watched this video, so it's not really that cool. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. You most likely didn't, because who learns? Nobody learns. Nobody ever thinks. This is life, yo. IQ differences is actually a controversial statement. Imagine what world you must live in for IQ differences to be a controversial statement. It's a poor, sad life, man. Very, 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 very weak, pathetic. I don't know how to call it. It's degraded. Alright then. Catch you in another one. Bye bye.